Millionaire laughed at his former schoolmate until a twist reveals who she became. The charity event hall was richly decorated, with lavish floral arrangements and sparkling chandeliers illuminating every corner with a warm, golden light. Eduardo, dressed in an impeccable Italian suit, moved among the guests with the confidence of someone who knew everyone there recognized his name and his wealth. With each handshake, his presence seemed to become even more imposing, as if he wanted to make it clear that he had reached a level few could achieve. The event was a kind of triumphant return to his hometown, where he was now treated like a local legend, the boy who once left with nothing and returned a millionaire. Amidst laughter and toasts with crystal glasses, Eduardo spotted a discreet woman moving among the guests, balancing a tray skillfully. Her hair was tied back in a simple bun, and the black and white uniform contrasted with the shine and glamour of the guests. It took him a moment to recognize her, but when he realized who she was, a flicker of disdain appeared in his eyes. "Clara," he said, approaching with a crooked smile, his eyes sparkling with a restrained malice. He held a champagne glass with casual disdain, gesturing with it as if it were an extension of his arrogance. "Well, who would have thought I'd find you here, serving drinks? And I thought you'd have followed those childhood dreams." Clara looked up, and a flash of surprise crossed her face for a brief moment, but it was quickly replaced by a serene, polite expression. She tilted her head slightly, as if she were receiving just another customer. "Life takes us down unexpected paths, Eduardo," she replied in a controlled tone with a light but dim smile. Eduardo laughed, a laugh that cut through the air like a blade. "Unexpected, huh? It seems some of us learned to take better paths." He took a sip from his glass, his gaze examining Clara from head to toe, as if he were appraising a cheap item in a luxury shop window. I always thought you'd stay around here, but I thought you'd at least, done something different." Clara looked away, maintaining her posture as she continued to serve the guests. For her, that night was just another opportunity to contribute to something she believed in, as the charity event was also close to her heart. She knew how much this type of work mattered to the community, and that's why she was there, not for lack of options, but by choice. However, Eduardo, blinded by his own arrogance, saw in her only the representation of a supposed failure he never wished upon himself. "Do you still remember your dreams of being a writer, Clara?" he taunted, raising an eyebrow. "I remember well, you sitting in the corners of the library, hidden behind those books full of absurd ideas about writing great novels. How did you put it? You wanted to be a famous author." He gave a short, sarcastic laugh. "Look where those dreams got you." Clara took a deep breath, staying strong. Her eyes, however, betrayed a shadow of melancholy, something Eduardo didn't notice or chose to ignore. "Yes, I remember, Eduardo. And sometimes dreams take on different forms than we imagined." Eduardo shook his head, almost as if he felt sorry. "What a shame, Clara. What a shame. Not everyone has the drive to get there. I knew how to seize opportunities, you see. I achieved everything through effort and ambition. Not everyone is made to win." Clara just nodded, gripping the tray in her hands, her fingers slightly trembling. But she remained quiet, gathering the pieces of her pride and dignity. She glanced around the hall and saw the curious eyes of the guests, some whispering to each other, amused by the silent spectacle Eduardo seemed so determined to create. She knew this was a test, proof that she had learned to swallow her pride and move forward, even when confronted by others' pettiness. The night was far from over, and Clara felt she would need all the patience she possessed to endure what was yet to come. Eduardo, on the other hand, seemed increasingly delighted with his own game of humiliation, driven by the pleasure of belittling someone who once he hadn't even considered relevant enough to remember. Eduardo, still savoring the irony of the reunion, saw some of his old friends approach to find out why he was so entertained. Noticing the growing audience, he felt even more encouraged to continue with his cruel theater. After all, what could be more amusing than flaunting his success in front of someone who clearly didn't go anywhere? He gestured to Clara as if she were a living example of the ordinary people he had left behind. "Do you remember Clara?" he asked his friends, laughing. "That girl from our class, kind of invisible, always with a book in hand. She used to say she was going to write novels and become famous. Well, it seems destiny had other plans, doesn't it?" Clara looked away, trying to keep busy with the tray, but it was impossible not to hear the muffled laughter around her. A pang of pain crossed her chest, but she refused to show any reaction. She knew Eduardo sought a morbid satisfaction in seeing her embarrassed. And even though that feeling of helplessness was overwhelming, Clara remained silent, her dignity the only thing she could hold on to at that moment. "Do you remember, Clara, how you would always sit at the back of the class, jotting things down in a little notebook? I never knew what you were writing so much," he continued in a loud tone so everyone could hear. "But you thought that was your ticket out, didn't you?" He let out a dry laugh. "It's funny how some of us imagine great things, while others are destined to stay in the same place." Eduardo's friends laughed, some out of courtesy, others unaware of the real discomfort they were causing. One of them, Carlos, shook his head, laughing with a condescending air. "Ah, Clara the dreamer. How much things change, right? Life has its ironies." Clara felt her face warm up, not out of shame that she had long since learned to overcome, but from an indignation growing in her chest, a tight knot she knew she had to swallow. She took a deep breath, staying composed. She wasn't going to give in to the spectacle. Each word from Eduardo seemed calculated to undermine any attempt she made to hold on to her pride. "Oh, I remember once," Eduardo continued, his voice now filled with fake nostalgia, "when Clara decided to write a play for the class to perform. She insisted so much, but no one wanted to participate, right? I think only the teacher found it amusing." He laughed again, shaking his head. "And you were so hurt, weren't you? You went a week without talking to anyone." "Eduardo," said Clara, with a calm but firm voice, trying to end the conversation. "That was a long time ago. Those memories mean nothing today." She hoped her response would be enough to make Eduardo back down, but he seemed to completely ignore her tone, preferring to continue with his amusement. "Really? Because to me, it feels like it was just yesterday," he replied, his eyes shining with satisfaction. "I always thought you'd learn to deal with reality, but look at that. It seems some people never change." At that moment, Clara felt a deep desire to put down the tray and walk away. But there was something within her, a resilience she had built over the years, that kept her standing firm, even though his words weighed down on her like a crushing burden. She remembered the bitter feeling of exclusion and the many times she had been ignored or ridiculed in school. Back then, she didn't yet understand why some people took pleasure in humiliating others. But now, she knew it was that very emptiness within them that drove such actions. And, in a way, this realization comforted her. Seeing that she wasn't reacting as he expected, Eduardo leaned a little closer, lowering his voice, though a cynical smile still played on his lips. "Did you really think that notebook full of poems and stories would take you far, Clara? Sometimes you just have to accept that dreams are just fantasies, things we leave behind as we grow up." She looked up at him, and this time there was a glimmer of something in her eyes, something Eduardo hadn't expected to see. It wasn't anger or resentment. It was compassion, as if for a second Clara saw something in him that no one else could. And perhaps that look was the most powerful response she could give. "Yes, Eduardo," she replied, with a calmness that left him unsettled. "We all have our own paths." She smiled softly, and this time the smile was genuine, as if finding an inner strength that Eduardo could not even begin to understand. "I hope your path has been everything you expected." Eduardo seemed momentarily at a loss for words, but soon regained his air of superiority. He was so immersed in his role as a triumphant man that he didn't even consider the possibility that he might be wrong. But Clara realized, at that moment, that she no longer needed to prove anything to him or to anyone. She had accepted her own path, her choices, and above all, the lessons life had offered her. And this, she knew, was something Eduardo would never be able to understand. As Eduardo returned to his friends, laughing and telling stories that glorified his achievements, Clara took a step back, discreetly moving away from the group. She went to the kitchen, where she leaned against the counter and took a deep breath, recovering from the flood of emotions she had tried to suppress. It wasn't easy to relive those memories, but somehow she felt stronger than ever. With her heart racing, Clara looked back at the hall one last time and decided she needed to finish that shift with dignity. She put her apron back on, lifted her head, and returned to the hall to continue her work. She knew she would face similar situations in the future, but at that moment, there was something no one could take from her: her peace of mind. Eduardo continued his performance enthusiastically, moving from group to group, recounting grand stories about his achievements. His words carried the vanity of someone who needed to reaffirm his own worth with each phrase. He spoke about his exotic travels, the mansions he had acquired in paradise-like locations, the luxury cars that only a few privileged people could afford. With each word, he seemed to seek in his listeners' faces the envy he so valued. Clara moved around the hall, serving drinks, collecting empty glasses, and above all, trying to keep her composure. She overheard fragments of Eduardo's stories each time she passed him, his friends laughing and reacting with a kind of superficial admiration. But now, after years of dealing with people like him, she recognized that desperate need for validation. At a certain point, Clara no longer saw Eduardo as superior or threatening. He seemed to her like an empty man, lost in his own ego and deluded by the power he thought he possessed. "Do you have any idea what it's like to close a deal in Dubai?" Eduardo said, his voice dripping with pride. "The meetings there are an event in themselves. French champagne, caviar, all top-notch. They know how to treat someone of value. Nothing like our little town. I'd say my name nowadays is worth more than many could dream of earning in a lifetime." The friends laughed and toasted, fascinated by the glamour of his words. One of them, Ricardo, nudged Eduardo and gave a mocking look in Clara's direction as she passed by with a tray of glasses. "And meanwhile, look, it seems some people really prefer not to leave this place, right? Or maybe they didn't have the chance." He smiled, with the same condescending look that Eduardo wore. Eduardo laughed and raised his glass as if toasting his own success. "The truth, Ricardo, is that not everyone has the drive to win," he said, clearly directing his words at Clara, who was only a few meters away, though without looking directly at her. "Some choose a comfortable life, without big ambitions. But not me. I worked hard, made the right sacrifices. That's why I'm here today, enjoying life while others are serving the drinks." Laughter echoed through the hall, but Clara, maintaining her silence, simply took a deep breath. She moved to a more isolated area of the hall, seeking a moment of peace. But before she could collect herself, she felt a light tap on her shoulder. When she turned, she saw Eduardo standing there, holding his own champagne glass with the confidence of someone who believed himself to be the center of the universe. He looked at her with a smile full of superiority. "Clara," he began, as if they were old friends recalling amusing memories. Did you know that I now own 3 companies? I built an empire from scratch while traveling the world, closing deals with people you probably only saw on television. He took a long sip of his champagne, leaning toward her with a smug look. It's a good feeling, you know? The feeling that I made all of this happen. Clara watched him in silence, absorbing every word. Something inside her wanted to confront him, to tell him that there was so much more to life than the emptiness he was trying to fill with displays of wealth. But she knew Eduardo wasn't ready to hear those truths. He lived in a bubble, an illusion he had constructed for himself and kept carefully inflated. Instead of responding, she simply nodded, keeping her calm gaze. You know, Clara, he continued, apparently oblivious to her discomfort. People who really want to change their lives seize opportunities. They don't just stand around waiting for something to happen. I took control of my destiny. And you, well, maybe you're comfortable here. Maybe this is all you ever expected. He laughed, feigning sympathy. I get it. Not everyone was born for great things. Clara took a deep breath and finally replied, her voice low and calm. Eduardo, not everyone measures success in the same way. Some of us prefer different achievements, less visible but equally important. He raised an eyebrow, clearly not understanding. For him, success was as simple as a number in a bank account or a collection of material possessions. Yes, less visible achievements, he said with a sarcastic laugh. I know what you mean, but in the end, what really matters is what we can accumulate, isn't it? After all, the world belongs to those with the courage to climb, to win. Clara just looked at him, and this time her gaze held neither compassion nor resentment, but a certain sadness. She knew Eduardo was lost in a game he didn't truly understand, that his success was a mask hiding a lack of purpose, the emptiness he feared facing. Deep down, he knew his wealth was fragile and that a life based solely on possessions and status wouldn't bring true happiness. Realizing that Clara wasn't reacting as he expected, Eduardo shook his head, taking a step back, visibly irritated by her lack of response. He needed her to react, to show some form of envy or humiliation. Without it, his own victory felt incomplete. Well, it was great seeing you, Clara, he finally said with a cold smile. I hope one day you realize that the world is full of opportunities for those who know how to seize them. He took one last sip of his champagne and turned away, leaving with an air of triumph. Clara watched as he walked away, still surrounded by his entourage of admirers, and felt, for the first time that night, at peace. She didn't need his approval, nor did she care about his judgment of her. There was something deeper in her life, something Eduardo couldn't understand. And that something, though invisible to everyone around her, was her greatest achievement. As Eduardo's laughter and stories filled the hall, Clara returned to her work, feeling lighter. She knew that, even amid glamour and ostentation, there were values Eduardo would never comprehend. And in the end, that was her true victory. At the end of the event, when the hall began to empty and the guests left amid cheerful goodbyes and promises to meet again, Clara finally took a deep breath. She collected the last empty glasses and tidied the tables with silent, almost ritualistic care, as if each item placed in the right spot helped dissipate the heavy energy Eduardo had cast over her throughout the night. The kitchen was almost empty, and she began folding her apron, ready to leave, when she heard a calm voice behind her. Clara, my dear. She turned and saw João, the event coordinator, watching her with a warm look. He was an elderly man with white hair and eyes that seemed to hold a serene wisdom built over many years. João was known for his kindness and generous heart, always willing to help those in need. Clara had worked with him at other charity events and had always admired the serenity he exuded. João, she greeted him, trying to hide the exhaustion and discomfort caused by the encounter with Eduardo. But somehow, Joao seemed to see right through her, as if every expression, every silent sigh, told him exactly what had happened that night. He approached her with a gentle smile and placed a hand on her shoulder. "I saw what happened," he said in a gentle but firm tone. "I know that some words can hurt more than they seem." Clara looked away, embarrassed, though she had done nothing wrong. "Oh, Joao, it's silly things from the past. Nothing worth remembering." Joao shook his head slowly. "Sometimes the past reappears to test us, Clara. And it's not easy, especially when they try to challenge our faith and our values." He looked at her with a deep gaze. "But you kept your calm and your dignity, and that shows the kind of person you are." Clara sighed, feeling a tremendous weight lifted by Joao's understanding. "You know, Joao, I thought I'd already overcome all of that. The humiliations, the feeling of inadequacy. But tonight, it was like going back to being that shy, dreamy schoolgirl no one took seriously." Joao smiled, shaking his head tenderly. "Dreamy and full of strength. This world needs people like you, Clara. People who carry their dreams with humility and don't lose faith, even in the face of adversity. And remember, my dear, true wealth lies in what we keep in our hearts." Clara took a deep breath, absorbing those words like a breeze of relief. "Sometimes it feels like the choices I made led me down a path different from what I imagined," she confessed. "I dreamed of writing, of doing something big, but I ended up finding purpose in small things like helping at this type of event." Joao nodded. "Clara, don't underestimate the beauty of the choices you've made. You have the gift of touching people's lives. The work you do, the way you treat everyone around you, even those who don't treat you well, that's a gift. The faith you carry and the kindness you radiate are things Eduardo's money could never buy." Clara smiled, feeling a quiet gratitude for Joao's words. The sincerity in his voice was like a balm, soothing the wounds the night had reopened. "I know you're right, Joao," she said after a moment of reflection. "Sometimes I catch myself thinking the world is unfair, but then I remember that God knows each one's heart. And maybe I am exactly where I'm supposed to be." Joao gently squeezed her shoulder, like a father comforting a daughter. "Yes, Clara, never doubt that. The trials we face shape us, and a kind heart like yours is a true treasure. Everything you do here, however humble it may seem, has a greater purpose." Clara felt tears burning in her eyes, but held them back. There was something deeply consoling in Joao's words, a sense that even in her less glamorous choices, there was a truth and a purpose that gave meaning to everything. He spoke with a serene wisdom, like someone who had understood life's essential values. Before they said goodbye, Joao paused and looked deeply into her eyes, conveying a silent understanding, as if he knew those words would be important to her in the future. "Believe in yourself, Clara. The world still has much to see from you. Don't let others' pride diminish you. God has a path for each of us, and yours is still unfolding." Clara nodded, moved, and embraced Joao with gratitude, feeling a comfort she hadn't felt in a long time. When they parted, she said goodbye, leaving the hall with a renewed sense of peace. Outside, the night air was fresh, and Clara looked up at the sky, where stars shone brightly. Those distant, silent, yet persistent lights seemed to remind her that true strength lies in resilience, in the ability to keep shining even when it seems like no one is watching. With a lighter heart, Clara began her walk home, reflecting on everything Joao had said. However, an intuition told her that this was not the end of the story. Even though Eduardo had left that night with his arrogance and disdain, Clara felt that Joao's words and gaze had planted a seed of peace and purpose in her heart. And something told her that soon the world would see who she really was. Days later, Eduardo was in his luxurious office in Sao Paulo, gazing at the city through the large glass windows, when his assistant entered with an excited expression. "Mr. Eduardo, I just received an invitation for you," the assistant said, handing him a thick, elegant envelope. "It's from one of the country's biggest publishers. It seems they want to discuss a project to publish your biography." Eduardo took the envelope, barely able to contain a smile of satisfaction. A biography about his life. It was everything he had ever wanted, a way to eternalize his success, to document his achievements so everyone could admire them. He already imagined himself flipping through the book, seeing his image on the cover, the chapters detailing his victories and the hard work that, according to him, had made him one of the country's wealthiest and most influential entrepreneurs. "Accept the invitation and schedule the meeting as soon as possible," Eduardo ordered with authority. "I want every detail taken care of. This book will be a milestone in the publisher's history and, of course, in mine." A few days later, he arrived at the publisher's building with his usual air of superiority. He was impeccably dressed, and his shoes gleamed as if they were new. Eduardo left no detail to chance, especially when it came to image. He was there to impress, to assert his presence, and to ensure that everyone saw him as the legend he believed himself to be. As he was guided to the meeting room, Eduardo looked around, analyzing every detail of the environment with a critical eye. Modern paintings adorned the walls, and the subtle aroma of fresh coffee filled the air. He could see the employees moving back and forth, busy with their tasks, but clearly curious about the renowned businessman's presence in their offices. Finally, the assistant led him to a set of double darkwood doors. "Please go in, Mr. Eduardo. The creative director is waiting for you." Eduardo raised his chin and entered the room with steady steps, prepared to meet yet another team of editors eager to hear him. But when he lifted his eyes and saw who was seated at the head of the table, he felt his world pause for a moment. Clara. There, in front of him, was Clara, impeccably dressed in an elegant skirt and blazer. Her hair, now loose, cascaded over her shoulders, and her eyes regarded him with a professional serenity he had never imagined seeing. The modest waitress he had humiliated days ago had disappeared, replaced by a poised woman who occupied that room with the ease of someone used to leading. She smiled discreetly, a restrained smile without a trace of irony or bitterness, but with unquestionable professionalism. "Good morning, Eduardo," she said, gesturing for him to sit. "I'm the creative director of the publishing house. I'm here to discuss your book." Eduardo stood still for a few seconds, unable to react. His mind struggled to process what he was seeing, as memories of the charity event resurfaced in uncomfortable flashes. He remembered every word of disdain he had spoken, every arrogant laugh. And now, there was Clara, in a position of authority he had never imagined. "Clara, how is this possible?" he murmured, unable to hide his shock. Clara watched him for a moment before responding, her expression remaining calm, almost impassive. "What exactly surprises you, Eduardo? Do you think the only path to success is yours?" He swallowed hard, feeling a warmth rise in his face, a sensation of discomfort that was both unfamiliar and unpleasant. This wasn't a meeting he could easily control. Clara wasn't someone he could manipulate with flattery or displays of wealth. She was in charge, and he felt that fully. I didn't know," he stammered, trying to regain his composure. "I didn't know you were successful." Clara kept her gaze steady, though her eyes sparkled with an understanding that went beyond mere professional detachment. "You didn't know because you never cared to look beyond appearances, Eduardo," she replied, with a softness that contrasted with the weight of her words. "You simply assumed that because I was working as a volunteer at a charity event, it meant I hadn't achieved anything in life." Eduardo, still seated, tried to process this. He felt small, vulnerable, as if the mask he had worn for years was beginning to fall apart under Clara's penetrating gaze. For the first time, his unshakable confidence seemed to waver. He opened his mouth to say something, but Clara continued before he could speak. "You know, Eduardo," she began, folding her hands on the table, "the volunteer work I do isn't due to a lack of options. It's a choice. I'm proud to give back to my community, to help people in ways you may never understand." Eduardo shifted uncomfortably in his chair, feeling the weight of her words. It made him think of something he had avoided for a long time. The possibility that success wasn't just about numbers and possessions, but about meaning, about the impact one left on the world. Clara took a deep breath, maintaining her professional tone. "But let's focus on what brought us here today. Your book." She opened a folder with some documents, sliding them across the table to Eduardo. "The publisher is interested in releasing your biography, but we need to discuss some important points. I'd like to know what message you want to convey with this story." Eduardo, still disoriented, looked at the papers in front of him and then back at Clara, who watched him attentively, waiting for his response. He hesitated, feeling, for the first time in years, as if he were being genuinely evaluated. She didn't seem to be there to flatter him, to feed his ego, or to agree with whatever he said. Clara was there as a professional, and a competent one, who wouldn't tolerate superficiality. I want to tell my success story," he said, trying to regain control. "I want to inspire people, to show how it's possible to win through hard work." Clara nodded, but her eyes remained critical. "I understand, but, Eduardo, I want you to think a bit deeper. To you, is success only about accumulating wealth? Or is there something more you want to convey? A story that truly inspires needs to have a message beyond mere display." He stared at her, unsure of how to respond. For the first time, he felt he needed to justify his own life, something he had never imagined doing. "Well, I always believed that success speaks for itself, that people want to see how someone rose, as I did." Clara leaned forward slightly, as if trying to reach something deeper in his words. "Is that really it, Eduardo? Or do you just want to show off your wealth and status? It's important to think about what truly holds value. This book could be more than just a showcase. But for that, you need to look beyond the surface." He fell silent, disturbed. Clara's calm tone, the depth of her words, made him question things he had never considered before. For the first time, he felt that everything he had accumulated, each house, each car, each title, was insufficient. And under Clara's attentive gaze, he felt exposed, without his defenses, forced to confront his own motivations. The meeting continued, but Eduardo knew that, from that moment on, his life would never be the same. Eduardo left the meeting room with trembling hands and a feeling of discomfort he couldn't name. The encounter with Clara, that woman he thought he knew, but who now seemed like a stranger, had shaken all the certainties he carried. It was as if, suddenly, he was looking at himself through a different mirror, a reflection that revealed an emptiness he had never wanted to see. In the days that followed, Eduardo tried to focus on business, but Clara's words haunted him. "Is that really it, Eduardo? Or do you just want to show off your wealth and status?" The question echoed in his mind like a silent judgment, forcing him to confront an uncomfortable truth. A week later, he received a phone call from the publishing house. It was Clara, asking him to return to discuss additional details about the book. Eduardo hesitated before agreeing, sensing that the conversation wouldn't just be about the project. Something more was coming, something he feared but also needed to face. When he arrived at the publishing house, Clara was waiting for him in her office. This time, the atmosphere was more informal, and she was without the strict executive attire, wearing a light blouse and an elegant coat. However, her posture remained firm, and her eyes held the same intelligent sparkle he had noticed during their first meeting. "Eduardo, thank you for coming," she said, gesturing for him to sit. There was a calmness in her voice, a serenity that seemed to reflect an inner strength he had never possessed. "We need to talk about the approach for your book. I read the material you sent, and I believe we can enrich the narrative if you're willing to be more honest." He frowned, uncomfortable with the suggestion. "Honest? I told everything that happened, Clara. My work, my sacrifices, everything that led me to success." She nodded, but there was a look of compassion on her face that made him feel uneasy. "I know you worked hard, Eduardo. I'm not questioning that. But I think there's something deeper here. A path you may be avoiding, but that could make all the difference for your readers." Eduardo took a deep breath, feeling cornered. "What else do you want me to say? That it wasn't easy? Everyone knows that." Clara leaned forward slightly, keeping her gaze fixed on his. "Eduardo, when you talk about success, it's as if everything boils down to money, to material achievements. But I wonder, who are you really beyond that? Is there something that drives you beyond status?" He remained silent, not knowing how to answer. In his entire life, no one had ever asked him such a simple yet difficult question. Who was he really? And what drove him? He had spent years building the image of a powerful man, accumulating wealth, impressing people. But in front of Clara, he felt fragile, as if the fortress he had built was made of sand. I've never thought much about it," he admitted, his voice sounding weaker than he intended. "To me, success has always been being recognized. Being someone." Clara nodded, as if deeply understanding what he was saying. "I know. I also once believed that recognition was everything. But over time, I learned that what we seek isn't always what we truly need." She took a deep breath and continued, her voice gaining a more personal tone. "Eduardo, you asked me at the charity event why I was there, serving as a waitress. And I think I never had the chance to explain." He looked at her, now genuinely curious. "I really didn't understand, Clara. You were always ambitious in school. You always had a big dream. And yet, you were there doing a job that I thought was humiliating," she finished softly. Eduardo didn't answer, but the silence between them confirmed what she already knew. Clara continued, with a gaze that seemed to drift somewhere in the past. "I wanted very much to be a writer, Eduardo. After we left school, I did everything I could to pursue that dream. I worked in modest jobs to pay for my studies, wrote for years, facing rejection after rejection, but I never gave up. Gradually, I entered the publishing market and found my place. I may not be the famous writer I dreamed of being, but I discovered something that gives me purpose." She paused, letting Eduardo absorb her words. "I discovered that it doesn't matter what title I hold or what position I occupy. What truly matters is what I do with my life, how I can help others achieve their dreams. That's why I work at charity events. Not because I need to, but because I choose to. Because it reminds me of where I came from and keeps me close to the things I consider important." Eduardo felt a wave of embarrassment, as if he were being confronted with something he had always known but preferred to ignore. You choose to do that?" he asked, almost unable to believe it. Clara smiled, with the same serenity as before. "Yes, Eduardo, I choose to. Humility is something that keeps us on the right path. And to me, true success is living with purpose, with meaning. It's not about accumulating, but about impacting. About leaving a legacy of kindness." He looked at her, feeling inexplicably small in front of her. All his achievements, all his possessions, now seemed like mere trinkets. For years, he had belittled Clara, treating her as someone insignificant. And yet, there she was, with a depth of character he could not reach. "Clara, I never thought you had achieved so much," he confessed, his voice low. I underestimated you and was cruel." She nodded, but without any bitterness. "I know, Eduardo. And honestly, I never held a grudge, because I learned it's not worth carrying that weight. Everyone has their own path, their own pains and ambitions. I followed mine, and you followed yours." Eduardo looked away, feeling a strange mix of shame and admiration. I didn't know that success could be something like this. I always thought it was just winning, conquering. Clara looked at him for a long moment, as if seeing beyond his words. "Maybe true success, Eduardo, is finding peace with who you are, with the choices you make and the impact you leave in the world. It's not a finish line you reach, but a path you walk." Eduardo swallowed hard, and for the first time in his life, he felt as if he was in front of someone who understood him in a way he had never allowed anyone to. Clara was the mirror he had avoided looking into, a reflection of a life lived with purpose and humility, something money could never buy. "Clara," he murmured, with a sincerity that surprised even himself, "thank you for showing me this. I don't think I ever really knew what I was searching for." She nodded, a gentle smile lighting up her face. "Life gives us chances to change, Eduardo, to find something that truly fills us. It's never too late to seek a new path." Eduardo left Clara's office with a feeling he still couldn't name, but knew was important. It was as if a part of him, dormant for so long, was waking up, and, for the first time, he wondered if everything he had accumulated truly held value, or if it was merely a shield, a way to hide the emptiness. As he walked through the city streets that evening, Eduardo felt that a new journey was beginning. It might not be easy, and it certainly wouldn't happen overnight, but somehow, he knew Clara had planted a seed in his heart, a seed that, with time, might grow into something more real, more profound, and finally, more lasting. A few days later, Eduardo was called to another meeting at the publishing house. This time, however, the purpose was to review the first draft of his book, created based on the interviews and notes he had shared with the editorial team. Sitting in the meeting room, he waited for Clara, feeling a strange mix of anxiety and anticipation. After their last encounter, something within him had changed, but he still wasn't sure how to handle this new whirlwind of emotions. Clara entered the room a few minutes later, carrying a bound copy of the draft. Her posture was firm, her expression serious, yet there was a softness in her eyes that, for Eduardo, felt almost like an invitation to self-reflection. She placed the draft on the table in front of him and sat down on the other side, observing him in silence for a few moments. "Eduardo, I'd like you to read this first version," she said, her voice calm but direct. "I believe this material represents your journey according to what you told us. But I need to be honest. In my opinion, something important is still missing. Something that could transform this story into a true inspiration." Eduardo frowned, picking up the draft with slight hesitation. "What do you mean by that, Clara? I shared everything about my work, my achievements, all the struggles to get where I am." Clara looked at him seriously, her expression slightly hardened. "Yes, you shared the details of your financial rise, the deals you closed, the businesses you consolidated. But that's not enough, Eduardo. Your achievements are impressive, but where are the lessons? Where are the truths that can truly inspire someone beyond mere display?" He opened the draft and flipped through a few pages, still not fully understanding what she meant. Those pages told his story in the way he had always envisioned, a tale of hardships and victories, a narrative that highlighted his perseverance and ambition. But, seeing Clara's expression, he realized that, to her, it was only a superficial version of his life. "Are you saying my story has no value?" he asked, trying to contain the irritation building in his voice. Clara took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "I think your story is still hidden Eduardo. "What's on the page is only the surface. Do you really believe your worth as a person is reduced to numbers and properties? Because if that's the case, then forgive my bluntness, but your story won't be any different from countless other entrepreneurs. It won't have the impact you want." That last sentence hit Eduardo like a blow. He felt a heat rise in his face, a mix of shame and anger. "Then what do you want me to talk about, Clara? The nights I slept on the office couch? The contracts I had to tear up? I've already told all that." She shook her head, remaining firm. "That's not what's missing, Eduardo. I want to know who you are beyond the businessman. I want to understand what you really feel, the fears, the doubts, the regrets. I want the reader to feel that you're not just an image of success, but a real person. Because in the end, success without purpose isn't inspiring. It's empty." Eduardo stared at Clara in silence, feeling exposed. He had never talked about these things, not even with himself. He had never admitted that behind all that success was a loneliness he masked with trips, cars, and contracts. He had never told anyone how, some nights, he felt insignificant amid his own showiness. He lowered his eyes, avoiding her gaze. "I don't know if I can do that," he murmured, almost to himself. "I don't know if I have anything more to say." Clara observed him patiently. She seemed to understand the invisible barriers he had built over the years, and her voice softened when she spoke again. "Eduardo, we all have something of value to offer. But to find that value, we need to be honest with ourselves. Sometimes it's painful because it forces us to confront parts of ourselves we'd rather ignore. But you have this opportunity now, a chance to turn this narrative into something bigger." He was silent for a long time, wrestling with the whirlwind of thoughts threatening to overwhelm his mind. Eduardo had always been a practical, objective man. To him, vulnerability was a luxury he couldn't afford. But in front of Clara, he felt that pretending any longer was an unbearable burden. Finally, he raised his eyes and met hers, which waited with an almost compassionate patience. "I always thought my life had a purpose," he said hesitantly. "I wanted to prove to myself that I could be someone, that I could be more than people thought. And I think, somewhere along the way, I got lost in that process." Clara nodded, encouraging him to continue. "How did you get lost?" He took a deep breath, as if admitting something he had kept locked away. "I got lost in the pursuit of validation, in the need for others' recognition. Everything I did was so people would see that I was important. And I guess deep down it was never enough. I could never fill that void." Clara remained silent, allowing him to open up. There was an understanding in her eyes, an empathy that was both refreshing and painful. She didn't judge him. She just listened, with the same patience he imagined she had for those she helped in her charity work. "I never knew how to deal with the idea of failure," he confessed, his voice almost a whisper. "I always thought that if I failed, it would mean I was nobody. So I spent my entire life trying to prove the opposite. And now I'm realizing that maybe I've built all this on something fragile, something that could collapse at any moment." Clara nodded, her voice low and gentle as she responded. "Eduardo, true purpose isn't built on the approval of others. It comes from within, from what you want to leave for the world, from what you want to see grow when everything you've accumulated no longer matters. You still have time to find that. And if you allow it, this book could be the beginning of something real." He took a deep breath, feeling a new emotion, a combination of fear and hope he could barely explain. For the first time in years, Eduardo felt that someone saw through the mask he wore, that someone understood him in all his vulnerabilities. And instead of feeling ashamed, he felt that maybe, just maybe, he could finally be honest with himself. I'll think about it," he said, with a sincerity that surprised even himself. "Maybe there's more to my story than just financial success. Clara smiled, and her smile was genuine, filled with silent empathy. "I believe there is, Eduardo, and I'm here to help you tell that story." He left the meeting feeling lighter, yet carrying a new weight, one not made of arrogance or vanity, but of the responsibility to look at his own life truthfully. As he walked back to his car, Eduardo reflected on Clara's words, on what it truly meant to inspire someone. Perhaps he could transform his story into something more than just a display of wealth. Perhaps, finally, he could find a purpose that couldn't be measured in figures. As he got into the car, he looked at his reflection in the rearview mirror. For the first time, he didn't just see the successful businessman. He saw a man still searching for something real. A man who might still have time to find himself, to build a life that could finally fill the emptiness he had spent so long trying to ignore. After the meeting, Eduardo spent the week in a whirlwind of emotions, revisiting memories he had buried and confronting truths he had avoided for so long. Clara's words echoed in his mind, and for the first time, he felt he needed, more than ever, to look within himself. Each time he thought about how his life had been built around the need to prove something to others, he felt a bitter sense of emptiness. Deep down, Eduardo knew he had never had anyone to truly share his burden with. Someone who could see beyond his facade and understand the insecurity he hid behind arrogance and material accomplishments. Clara had been the first person to truly see through him, and now he felt an uncontrollable need to continue that conversation, to be honest with someone, perhaps even with himself. A few days later, Eduardo took the initiative to schedule a private meeting with Clara. He didn't want to talk about the book or contracts or the publisher. For the first time, he wanted to open up without the mask he had worn for so many years. Clara accepted the invitation naturally, and they arranged to meet at a discreet cafe in the city center, away from the eyes of the office and the formality of their roles. When Clara arrived, she found Eduardo already seated at a table near the window, watching the street movement with a distant, almost melancholic expression. He looked different, more human, more vulnerable. As she approached, Eduardo stood to greet her, and Clara noticed the weariness in his eyes that he couldn't hide. "Clara, thank you for coming," he said, trying to mask the nervousness in his voice. "Of course, Eduardo," she replied, sitting across from him with a warm smile. "What would you like to talk about?" Eduardo sighed, hesitant, and for a moment seemed lost in his own thoughts. Finally, he broke the silence. "You know, Clara, I've been thinking a lot about everything we discussed at the publisher, about what it really means to have a story worth telling. And I realized that maybe I've spent my whole life running from who I truly am." Clara watched him attentively, encouraging him to continue. There was patience in her gaze, as if she knew that this moment was essential for him. "When I was a child," he began, diverting his gaze to the street, "my family had almost nothing. My father was a simple, hard-working man, but he never achieved much. And my mother, she always dreamed that I would become someone important, someone she could be proud of." Eduardo paused, seeming to find the right words. "I clung to that dream of hers with all my might. I spent my life believing that if I could have more than they had, it would prove I was worthy of love, of respect from others. I think it was never about the money itself. It was about never feeling small again like I did in my childhood." Clara nodded, understanding the weight of those words. "Sometimes what we seek in life is just a reflection of our unresolved pains, Eduardo. You turned that need to be someone into an endless struggle, but maybe you lost sight of what truly mattered." He nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the coffee cup he held. "I lost myself in the process," he admitted, his voice trembling. "I turned my life into an endless competition. And the worst part is, the more I achieved, the emptier I felt. I thought that if I had everything, I would feel complete. But I was wrong. I always thought I needed validation, but now I realize what I needed was to accept myself as I am. Clara smiled gently, her eyes filled with understanding. Eduardo, you've spent your entire life trying to fill a void that can only be filled from within. The acceptance you seek won't come from applause or material achievements, but from who you decide to be when no one's watching. Have you ever asked yourself what you truly want to leave behind in this world? He took a deep breath, feeling that he had reached the heart of the matter. I don't think I've ever really stopped to think about that. I was always obsessed with the idea of winning, of proving that I was capable. But now, I see that it doesn't hold the value I thought it did. Clara nodded, encouraging him to explore this new perspective. Then, Eduardo, maybe it's time to start building something that truly makes sense to you. Something that brings you peace, not just success. He looked at her with a mix of gratitude and vulnerability. Clara, how did you manage this? This serenity, this clarity about what really matters? You seem so invisible to others. And now I see you have a strength I never had. Clara smiled, and this time there was a sad glint in her eyes. Life taught me, Eduardo. I learned from the hardships, from the defeats, from the times I had to choose between my dreams and reality. I spent a long time trying to fit in, but when I realized that true strength came from my own essence, I found peace. He remained silent, absorbing her words as if each sentence was a key, unlocking new understanding within him. I always saw you as someone who hadn't achieved anything, he confessed, feeling shame welling up again. But now I realize that you have something I always wanted but never knew how to reach. Clara placed her hand on his in a comforting gesture. Eduardo, you still have time to find that. It's never too late to reconnect with what truly matters. Maybe what you were always searching for outside yourself was inside you all along. Maybe the success you're looking for lies in the ability to genuinely touch people's lives. He nodded, feeling a weight lift from his chest. For the first time, he felt he could live without the masks he had worn for so long. Perhaps he could finally free himself from the need to prove something to the world and find a way of living that was truly authentic. I want to change, Clara, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I want to find a way to make my life meaningful. And I want to start now. Clara smiled, and there was a glimmer of hope in her eyes. Then start, Eduardo. Start with your book, but write it with truth, without fear of showing who you really are. People don't need to see just your victories. They need to see your journey, your weaknesses, what you've learned. That's the real story worth telling. Eduardo nodded, feeling that, for the first time, he was on the right path. That conversation had opened a door within him, a door he hadn't even known existed. And as he left the cafe, he no longer felt the weight of arrogance or the need to show off. Instead, he felt a peace he hadn't experienced in a long time, as if he could finally be himself. He looked up at the sky, watching the sun set on the horizon. The orange and pink hues painted the world around him, and he realized that, just as the day was ending, a phase in his life was also coming to an end. From that moment on, Eduardo knew that a new path was opening, a path where the value of his existence would no longer be measured by what he owned, but by who he was. That night, Eduardo arrived home feeling as if he had shed all the layers of arrogance and vanity he had worn for so long. He looked at himself in the hallway mirror, observing his reflection with a strange mix of discomfort and curiosity. It was as if, for the first time, he was seeing a stranger, a man who, despite all his success, looked tired and empty. Eduardo passed through the living room decorated with the luxury he had accumulated over the years. Every piece of furniture had been carefully chosen to impress visitors. Every painting, every detail designed to demonstrate his taste and wealth. But now, All that opulence felt suffocating, like a prison he had built with his own hands. He wondered how many times he had sought happiness in the next acquisition, in the next status symbol, believing that these objects could fill the emptiness he felt. How many times he had deceived himself. He turned off the lights in the living room and slowly went up the stairs, heading to his office. There, in one of the locked drawers, he kept a small wooden box, a relic from his past, something he rarely opened. He sat in his leather chair, the box on his lap, and after a long sigh, turned the key and opened it. Inside the box were memories he had almost forgotten. A yellowed photo of his family, with him as a child, from when life was simple but honest. Next to the photo was a worn notebook where he had written down his childhood dreams, a list of wishes and ambitions, penned with the innocence of someone who didn't yet know the weight of expectations and the need to impress. Eduardo flipped through the notebook with trembling fingers, remembering each childhood dream. On those pages, he had written about the desire to do something great, but there was also something more, the desire to be happy, to be loved and respected not for what he owned, but for who he was. He felt a pang of sadness as he realized how far he had drifted from that child, from his pure and sincere dreams. In the middle of the notes, he found a sentence he had written when he was 12, in crooked, hesitant letters. "I want to help my family have a better life, and I want to do something that truly makes a difference." Eduardo stared at that sentence as a lump formed in his throat. At some point, he had abandoned that goal. He had replaced the desire to make a difference with the desire to accumulate, and now he felt the weight of that choice like an anchor holding him at the bottom of the ocean. He leaned back in the chair, closed his eyes, and let the tears flow without shame. For the first time, Eduardo allowed himself to cry for the child he had been, for the young man who had dreamed of being a good person, someone who truly contributed to the world. He felt a mix of regret and relief, as if that moment of vulnerability was a release. It was painful, but at the same time, he felt more human than he ever had. That night, Eduardo barely slept. He spent hours reflecting on his life, on the decisions he had made, and the people he had left behind in his relentless pursuit of status. He remembered the classmates he had ignored, the employees he had humiliated, and above all, Clara, the strength and dignity she possessed despite everything he had said and done. She was the true example of success, someone who lived by her values, not by the values imposed by others. At dawn, an idea began to take shape in his mind, something he would never have considered before. Eduardo realized that perhaps, to find the peace he so desperately sought, he needed to do something concrete, something that reflected the new person he was trying to become. And then, as he saw the first ray of sunlight illuminating the horizon, he decided he would sell part of his businesses to fund a charity project. A project that would help underprivileged youth achieve their dreams, so they wouldn't have to sacrifice their values and dignity in the name of success. For the first time, he felt in harmony with the boy who, years ago, had written in that worn notebook the desire to make a difference. In the days that followed, Eduardo began putting his plan into action. He contacted lawyers and consultants, organizing the sale of assets and outlining the scope of the charity project. The idea was simple. He would create a scholarship and mentorship institute for young people who, like him in the past, had dreams but lacked the means to achieve them. But this time, he wanted to do it quietly. He didn't want applause or recognition. He wanted to do something that would have a real impact, something that was finally bigger than himself. When news of his charity project began to circulate discreetly, some people were incredulous, others doubtful. Many thought it was a marketing ploy, an attempt to improve his image. But Eduardo didn't care. He knew he was doing it not for others, but for himself. And somehow, he felt at peace with that. A few months later, Eduardo was invited to another charity event in his hometown, but this time he went as a volunteer. He wore simple clothes, without expensive brands, without the arrogance that he once wore as armor. He blended in with the other volunteers, helping to set up tables, organize materials. For the first time, Eduardo felt truly integrated, part of something greater than himself. And it was there, amid the preparations, that he saw her. Clara was in the hall, coordinating the event with the same serenity and dignity as always. When their eyes met, she looked surprised but soon approached him with a genuine smile on her lips. "Eduardo," she said softly, "what are you doing here?" He smiled, feeling inexplicably grateful for the question. "I came to help Clara. As a volunteer." She nodded, studying him with an expression of understanding and pride. "I'm glad to see this. You found something that truly matters, didn't you?" He nodded, feeling the weight of honesty in his words. "Yes, Clara. I think I finally understood what you were trying to show me. I realized that true wealth isn't in what we possess, but in what we can offer to others. Thank you for helping me see that." Clara smiled, and this time there was something more in her eyes, perhaps a hint of admiration or even respect. Sometimes we need to lose something to understand the value of life. "I'm glad you found your way, Eduardo." They continued side by side, organizing the event, now as equals. Eduardo knew he still had a long road ahead, and that this change would not erase the mistakes of the past. But, for the first time, he felt he was on the right path. He felt connected to something real, something that at last filled the void that money had never been able to touch. And as he worked, surrounded by people who shared his new worldview, Eduardo realized that he was no longer alone. He had finally found what he had always been searching for, a purpose that wasn't measured in figures, but in impact. Something that defined him not by what he possessed, but by what he was able to give. At the end of the event, Clara said goodbye with a firm handshake and one last smile. "Congratulations, Eduardo. You found what truly matters." And at that moment, he knew that his real journey was just beginning. Months passed since the charity event, and Eduardo's transformation had become evident to everyone around him. He had indeed followed through with his plan to create the Scholarship and Mentoring Institute for Underprivileged Youth, now named the Hope Institute. The project, funded by the sale of part of his businesses, quickly gained quiet recognition, not for prestige or ostentation, but for the depth of impact it had on the lives of dozens of young people. Eduardo was no longer the man seeking applause. He didn't appear on magazine covers or accept invitations to glamorous events. Instead, he dedicated himself to the Institute with a quiet and sincere determination, working personally with the young people, learning their stories, and helping them chart paths he himself had never had. This new life brought him a peace he had never imagined he could attain. One afternoon, while Eduardo was reviewing financial reports for the Institute in his modest office, now far from the luxuries he once considered essential, he received an unexpected invitation, a letter from Clara, inviting him to attend an event at the publishing house, where she would present the launch of a new collection of books by young authors. Clara had stayed in touch since Eduardo's transformation, and he sensed that she was pleased with his changes, but now the invitation felt special, personal. She wanted him to be there. When the day of the event arrived, Eduardo dressed in a simple suit, leaving behind the shine and luxury he once flaunted. He arrived at the publishing house feeling light, calm, and soon spotted Clara, who was on stage making final adjustments to the presentation. She looked more radiant than ever, and when she saw him, she smiled with a warmth that he now knew was genuine. After the event began, Clara introduced the collection with a passion that captivated the audience. It was an anthology of stories written by young talents discovered through literary competitions held by the publishing house. Each author had been carefully guided and encouraged to tell stories of their own lives, stories reflecting struggles, dreams, and hopes, giving voice to people who often went unnoticed. When Clara finished her presentation, she thanked the audience and paused before making one last dedication. And finally, I would like to dedicate this project to someone very special. Someone who showed me that even when we think we're on the right path, life always offers us new opportunities to grow and become better people. An inspiration that came from where I least expected, and who taught me the true value of humility and transformation. Eduardo, sitting in the audience, realized that Clara was looking at him. He felt the weight and sincerity of her words, and a warmth filled his chest. Everyone turned to him, and in a gesture of acknowledgement, Eduardo gave a slight bow, his heart filled with a mix of humility and gratitude. After the event, Clara approached him, smiling. "You look happy, Eduardo. Truly happy." He returned the smile, feeling that, for the first time, those words were not just a formality. "I am Clara, and I owe much of that to you." She shook her head gently. "You don't owe me anything. The change came from within you. I just gave you a little push." They both laughed, sharing a moment of connection that only those who have undergone deep transformations can understand. "Can I show you something?" Clara asked, gesturing for him to follow her. She led him to a private room in the publishing house, where a dark wooden table was covered with manuscripts and drafts. At the center of the table was a book without a cover, just the bound pages filled with a familiar handwriting, his own. "I reviewed the manuscript of your book," Clara said, holding the material carefully, as if it were a precious object. "And I want you to know it's one of the most authentic and powerful stories I've ever had the pleasure of editing." Eduardo looked at the book in his hands, feeling a wave of emotions. Writing that book had been a painful but transformative process. He had revisited his flaws, his mistakes, and also the lessons he had learned. It wasn't an ordinary biography of a successful businessman. It was an honest account of someone who had lost himself in vanity and, after a painful fall, found a path to redemption. "I don't know if the world is ready to see the real Eduardo," he said with a nervous smile. Clara touched his shoulder in a gesture of encouragement. "The world needs stories like this, Eduardo. Stories of redemption, of humility. Your book will inspire people not because you succeeded, but because you fell and chose to rise in a different way. That's the true victory." He smiled, grateful for her confidence and the support she had given him along that difficult path. "Thank you, Clara. I don't know if I could have done it without you." "You did it," she replied firmly. "I just showed you what you already had within yourself." In that moment, Eduardo felt he had finally found peace. He knew the world would still see him as a businessman, a man of business. But now there was something more to his story, something he had never imagined he would have the courage to reveal. He had learned with Clara that the true value of a person isn't in what they own, but in their ability to grow, to redeem themselves, and to transform their life into something that truly matters. As he left the publishing house that night, Eduardo felt the weight of the past finally lift from his shoulders. He walked through the streets with a lightness he hadn't felt in a long time, aware that, from then on, each step he took would be guided by a real purpose, not by an endless pursuit of recognition. And as he walked under the gentle city lights, Eduardo smiled to himself. He knew his journey was only beginning, but now, for the first time, he would face it with a light heart and the certainty that to leave a true mark on the world, he only needed to be someone with the courage to live with humility, purpose, and faith. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. These other stories will move you as well. Click to keep watching.